to A Year of Career, 52 Practical Answers to Your Questions. I'm Erin Wolfram. I own and operate Career Advantage and Career Advantage Golf, and I help professionals feel more confident and prepared throughout their job search by helping with resumes, cover letters, LinkedIn profiles, mock interviews, personal portfolios, things like that. But each week in this podcast, I answer one question from the public. And this week's question is, what are appropriate ways to request workplace accommodations if you have a disability? And I've invited my friend Wendy Shoemaker here today to join us. Wendy and I have known each other for about 15 years. We worked together for 13 years at the University Career Center at the University of Kansas. And I'm going to go ahead and let Wendy introduce herself.
Hi everyone, and thanks for inviting me to participate, Erin. I'm really excited to be part of this conversation today. So I'm the director of the University Career Center, and I've been at KU for about 18 years now, and I've worked in a variety of roles at KU. I've been a career coach and continue to be a career coach. I've taught classes, and I've coordinated a whole bunch of programming. And one that is really particularly relevant to the conversation today is a program that I've coordinated with the Student Access Center, and that's that office on campus that works with students and helping them with academic accommodations. And so we share resources, we develop joint training for our staffs, for campus partners, and we coordinate some employment outreach programs for students registered with the office, the Student Access Office. So that's a little bit about me.
Well, yeah, that's great. And so that's exactly why I invited you to be here today, because I know you have some fantastic information, and, we've worked together on some of this, throughout the years. So we'll just dive right in with some kind of guiding questions. So first, just in general, what tips do you have for those needing to request workplace accommodations if they do have a disability?
Yeah, great question. So the first thing to remember is it's really important to ask. So, much like in college, the individual needs to advocate for themselves for a question they need to initiate. They need to request the accommodations in the workplace. So, for example, if you've used accommodations in other settings in the past, such as a college or university setting or a workplace setting, you already have the basic skills in line to do this. You can do this again. So, for example, that you're going to need to, request and provide medical documentation, or providing documentation from a qualified healthcare professional that outlines your functional limitations and how they could impact your work. About that,
Sure.
Or your academic work, if the only experience that you've had is as a college student. The process is really the same. It's really, you need to provide some documentation, you need to initiate the discussion, and it's really a collaborative process between you and your employer. You need to bring some self-advocacy skills, and so part of that is really understanding the nature of the functional limitations of your disability and how it impacts your work, because it is a collaborative process, a discussion between you and the employer. So I think that's probably the most important tip is ask, to initiate. That's really important. There's no really wrong way to do it, but you do need to understand that it's a process to once you initiate, there's a whole process that is involved.
Definitely. And I love that you use the word advocate multiple times, because that is so important. And also, I really liked how you kind of likened it to those accommodations that you may have needed in an academic setting, and just really translating that to the workplace, right? So figuring out, what were your needs as a student, and what are your needs as you learn and gather new information, and how does that apply to the workforce, right? And
Right.
So how could that transition, and how can you help explain that to your employer clearly, right?
Exactly. And that's part of the process. And so if you've had that experience as a college student, you've had these discussions before with your faculty or with your academic accommodations through the process of requesting academic accommodations. And so this should feel a little familiar
Sure.
in terms of how to initiate and how to talk about that. So.
Sure. Absolutely. So, let's talk a little bit about hidden disabilities, because I think sometimes this is a little bit more difficult for folks who do have hidden disabilities, or maybe someone who, has been in the workforce for years and then all of a sudden now needs accommodations. Maybe they didn't at the beginning, but now something has happened and they need accommodations. Let's talk about that. So do you have any specific suggestions related to either hidden disabilities or those who may find that, sort of down the road, a few years into their professional career, they now need accommodations.
Right, not uncommon. So yeah, what you and I have been talking about is if you've been a college student, how to translate that. But with a hidden disability, it's really even more important to take the initiative because it's your choice, it's your option to disclose. The thing to remember about disability and accommodations is that you're going to be, as soon as you disclose that you have a disability, you initiate the discussion, you're going to be covered under the American with Disabilities Act. All right. But if you don't disclose, you are not covered.
Okay.
So for example, if you run into some issues because you've not requested an accommodation in your workplace and the ADA is not retroactive. And so really the idea here that the tip, and this kind of leads into this is helpful for the previous question, is another tip, is about requesting, is to request early. Before you run into troubles where you're running into some performance issues because you are simply not getting the accommodation to do your best work. The part of this is the way to think about it is, there's some adjustments in your environment that you need to have in place in order for you to do your best work, and that's the way to approach it. I think there's this impression that HR, that this is going to be a problem for HR, but when in reality,
right.
they really want you to do well in your role. They hired you, they believe in you, they want to make sure that your environment is such that you will do well in your job. So most workplace accommodations actually are very low cost or even no cost. And that's the other impression, that these are going to be really expensive, but the majority of them can be small adjustments or that required low or no cost to the workplace setting. So I think all that to say is that it's really up to you, especially when you have a hidden disability. You're the one who has to initiate, but think of it as a protection and a way for you to show up and do your best work at work. So.
Definitely. Yeah. So, really being proactive, it sounds like is key. That was something that I kind of took away from that. And then also, like you said, HR, your supervisor, your colleagues, like you said, they hired you, they want you to succeed. That hiring process, hiring somebody, training someone, that's expensive. So, they don't want to have to hire somebody else. So they, like you said, they want you to succeed. They want you to, have everything that you need to bring your best every day, because they don't want to go through that hiring process again. That can be very stressful, very expensive, very time consuming. So I love that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So Wendy, do you have any maybe suggestions or examples of low cost or no cost accommodations, or even, other accommodations that you've seen in the workplace?
Yeah, so an example of a low-cost workplace accommodation is text reading software for individuals with disability or reading disabilities like dyslexia. So there are various free software programs out there that can be used to read emails, Word documents, even PDFs, such as Natural Reader, Read and Write. Most Macs and PCs will also have some software options available to them. So that's an example of a low or no cost accommodation.
Okay.
Depending on the nature of the severity of the disability and accommodations that may have a cost associated, I think an individual could reach out to their state rehabilitation agency and see if some of those costs could be covered by that agency. So for example, adjustable furniture, that could be covered by that rehabilitation agency. So I think that could also assist with a workplace accommodation.
Sure. Okay. Yeah. Thank you so much for those examples. That's great. So, I think sometimes people think, as they're going through the job search process, and maybe they need accommodations for disability, they're not sure if they should bring this up, during the application process, if they should wait until they are offered a position, if they should wait until their first day on site. Do you have any suggestions for that, as far as, maybe when during the process to ask for those accommodations?
Yeah, a great question, because that's something that we talk with students quite a bit, is because it's something, unless it's a unless you have a disability as such that you need an accommodation in the interview, it's really going to be up to you to initiate or be proactive about initiating and when to initiate. So, so when to initiate is really kind of based on a variety of factors. And, the general rule of thumb is that, the general advice, I would say, is that we advise that students or applicants, I should say, wait until after they have a job offer and have accepted the job offer to initiate the discussion around requesting workplace accommodation, especially if it's their choice to do so.
Right.
But, I've sat in on lots of, I've talked with professionals who it's part of their identity. It's really important part of how they check into the values of an organization. It's part of who they are, how they show up to work, and they put it into their cover letter and make it very clear about how it is and how it is for them. It could be that they're very involved in the community, and by showing that, and so they're really disclosing that way, and that is your choice too, because then you're that's really up to you to do it in that way. But so there's really choices. It's really based on a variety of factors and based on the individual. There's a really cool worksheet that we have on our website that goes into that, kind of advantages, disadvantages, when and where, that I'll highlight later.
Okay.
Provide some guidance.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
And I think, you brought up a good point too. We've been talking about workplace accommodations in the actual job, but you're absolutely right. There are people who may need accommodations during the actual process, either, filling out the application or during the interview, things like that. So I'm glad that you really brought that up too, because, it's not just once you have the job, but there certainly could be needs, throughout the entire application process. So thank you so much for bringing that up. So you've mentioned a couple of resources already. You mentioned, ADA, you mentioned the handout on the career.ku.edu website. So what are some other resources or websites or tools that you have found to be helpful for folks that you've worked with?
Yeah, no, happy to share this because we've actually gathered quite a few resources and we just recently curated those resources once again this on our website. So it's career.ku.edu/ADA.
Okay.
And on that site is a whole bunch of links on resources for students with disabilities, but it's available to the public and anyone can access. So I'm going to highlight a few that I think are really helpful, especially relevant to our conversation today. One is, if you scroll down to the bottom, there's different sections on jobs and internships, and those are great too. But if you scroll to the bottom, there's a section called Disclosing to an Employer. And there's a bunch of links. And there's that worksheet that I was mentioning earlier called Disclosure Options. And it's just a straight up Word document, made into a PDF. But it's really, I've been told by lots of people around the country that they love that and they refer it and they have it linked on their website. And so it's, the time of disclosure, advantages, disadvantages, issues, and it really lays it out so people can have the information they need to make the decision when to disclose. Great handout there. Another one that's linked out in that section is the Job Accommodation Network, or Ask Jan. And this is a superb resource that outlines specific guidance for disabilities and functional disabilities or functional limitations, and even presents specific situations and solutions. And so it's a guide for employers, it's a guide for workers. It's a well-known resource, and it's one that I like to point out when we're in that conversation around disclosure and how that shows up.
That's great.
So, the fantastic resource. And then on that same page are 3 videos that we've made in the last couple of years, really exactly around what we've been talking about. There's 3 different videos, one each that goes into further detail on disclosure with if you have a visible disability, one for if you have an invisible disability, and then one that really dives further into the ADA and functional limitations. And so those are great videos. They're short, and I think it goes into pretty good detail and depth about the things that we've been discussing today. So.
Definitely. Yeah, those sound great. And I think that, those sound like valuable resources, whether you are the job seeker, the employee, or the employer, or the supervisor, or the HR manager, who may be, getting these requests from folks. So I think that that's important too, that, a lot of, HR people, they learn this in their education, but maybe they haven't had to actually supply accommodations for several years. So they might need a bit of a refresher on where to go to access some of those resources that they need. So I think that these tools can be valuable, just as valuable for the, HR teams or the supervisors as they can be for the actual employee or the job seeker. So those are wonderful. Any final thoughts, Wendy, on anything before we kind of wrap up?
I just want to thank you for inviting me to participate in this discussion. This is an important topic. I think this is something that, I work, we have been working at KU to really equip students with the tools and resources so that they feel that they can advocate for themselves in the workplace. It's really important that they use the skills and knowledge and resources they've been using all along, as especially as their experience as being students and as they transition to the workplace. But I think it's just knowledge that anyone can use. Is step up and advocate for yourself, and think of it as a discussion, a conversation that you initiate in order for you to do your best work. And I think once you approach it from that angle, it takes the fear out of that. It takes the concern out of that. So I hope people get something out of this discussion today.
Definitely. Well, I think this is really valuable information, and I thank you so much for joining me today. If any listeners out there are KU students or KU alumni, Wendy and her team, they're great people. Like I said, I worked with them for 13 years, and I highly recommend their services. So check them out. They're at the University Career Center at the University of Kansas. And as Wendy said, the website that she referred to was career.ku.edu/ADA, or just career.ku.edu. So please check them out if you're a KU student or alumni. If you need other services, I'm more than happy to help. You can check me out at careeradvantageresumes.com or careeradvantagegolf.com. I also have social media. I'm at Career Advantage Resumes on Facebook, LinkedIn, and Instagram, and Advantage Career on Twitter.